so much.
You bet.
God bless you. This
Thank
has
you.
been an exciting adventure getting up to the runway, ready for liftoff for this series. There are some lessons that correspond with each night's presentation. And we have a presentation tonight. 2 lessons. You'll find some of these mentioned online in the offers. It's the millennial man, and that is our theme for tonight's study. And a corresponding or a complementary lesson for that is called Back to Jerusalem. Talks about the inspiration of Scripture and how you know you can trust it. And so some of the sites have these lessons. There's more online. If you go to mostamazingprophecies.com, and you'll find that information there. You might wonder, where did Amazing Facts get the name Amazing Facts? It started about 40 years ago with a radio broadcast by Joe Cruz, and he would begin with some amazing fact from science or nature or history, and then he would introduce spiritual, biblical subjects, and they became very popular. People love amazing facts. And I like to start each program with an amazing fact. Everybody, of course, has heard about the story of the Titanic, and there have been many books, several editions of movies written on the subject. There was a seaman by the name of Morgan Robertson, and he had a dream, and based on these impressions, this vision he had, he thought that would make a great story. So he wrote a story about this luxury cruise liner that was 1,000 feet long and 11 stories tall called the Titan. And on its maiden voyage, filled with millionaires, it struck an iceberg because they were trying to break a speed record. And he tried to get the publishers to publish it. But of course, you're figuring, why would they want to publish that? I mean, it's basically the Titanic all over again. Matter of fact, he named his book The Titan. And they thought, well, why try to rewrite that story? But what most people don't know is it was not the Titanic. The Titan was actually written in 1898 by Morgan Robertson. Now, look at some of the amazing parallels between his story, and I think I've got a few of them here in my notes tonight that I'd like to share with you. His book that he wrote about the Titan and the Titanic, 13 years before the Titanic was built. In his book, The Wreck of the Titan, the length was 800 feet. The Titanic, 882 feet. Titan, 90 feet wide. Titanic was 92 feet. Top speed for the Titan, 25 knots. The Titanic, 23 knots. Water compartments, both ships were deemed unsinkable. 19 watertight compartments in the Titan. Titanic had 16. Both had 3 propellers, which was unheard of in the day when he wrote that. Capacity, 3,000 tons for the Titan, 3,200 tons for the Titanic. Number of people on board, 2,000 in the Titan, 2,250 on the Titanic. There weren't enough lifeboats on either boat. Only 24 on the Titan, 20 on the Titanic. Catch this. In Robertson's book, written 13 years before the Titanic was built, it sailed in April from New York. Titanic, of course, sailed in April to New York. And I could go on and on with the parallels. It's absolutely uncanny. And you wonder if this dream he had about writing a novel, if it was some kind of a divine premonition. Can anyone really know the future? I believe the answer is yes. There was a day when I would have said no. Life is just a series of spontaneous accidents. The study we're going to look at tonight, dealing with the final kingdom, is a good preview to help you understand that there is a plan, that God is watching over you, and He has a plan for your life. There are kingdoms that are in conflict, and they're fighting over the dominion of your mind and your heart. Well, before we go to the last kingdom, probably a good idea to start with the first kingdom in the Bible. If you go to the book of Genesis, you'll find there in Genesis chapter 10, verse 8 through 10, talks about the first kingdom and the first king. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, that may sound familiar to you. Probably Babylon sounds a little more familiar, which was the title that it evolved into. And then, of course, you heard about the Tower of Babel that was built in Nimrod's kingdom. And you remember that they wanted to make a name for themselves. They did not trust that the Lord was not going to destroy the earth with a flood again. They built this massive tower, represents man's desire to save himself. They wanted to make a name for themselves, Genesis 11 tells us. God was not pleased. He confounded the languages of the earth there. The construction project to build this tower to reach to heaven, sort of man trying to build his way to heaven, was destroyed, and men began to scatter. And it's interesting that there are connections between all the different dialects of the world today, and they can be traced back to that Tower of Babel. Now, one of the most interesting pieces of geography in the world is the land of Iraq. Matter of fact, second only to Israel, Iraq is mentioned more in the Bible than any other country. Iraq is the place, of course, where you find Babylon, Nineveh, Assyria, the Garden of Eden. This is where Jonah went, the land of Daniel, Ezekiel, Esther, and some surmise that even Job, the land of Uz, could have been within its realms. The Assyrian Empire, did I mention Nineveh? Iraq is constantly in the Bible, the country that it now encompasses now. Some people may not be aware, but this famous despot, Saddam Hussein, he had aspirations that Iraq would be the next world empire. Think about it. When he invaded Iran in 1980, he knew that between the resources of oil in Iraq and those he would get by conquering Iran, he would hold the major oil reserves of the world. You think it was an accident that he went to Kuwait? He was very interested in world dominion. It's interesting that one of the heroes for Saddam Hussein was the greatest king of Babylon. I'm talking about the one who came after Nimrod. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon at its zenith. Saddam has tried to market himself and brand himself as the reincarnation of this great king of Babylon named Nebuchadnezzar. Part of the reason that he idolized Nebuchadnezzar is because Saddam Hussein, like many but not all of the Arabs, hates Israel, hates the Jews. And Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel, he conquered Jerusalem, and he destroyed and burnt the Jewish temple. So Saddam has reveled in the idea that he is the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. Matter of fact, he's had himself photographed in Nebuchadnezzar's ancient war chariot. You can see murals and paintings around Babylon where it's got Nebuchadnezzar and Saddam Hussein side by side, his hero. He wanted to rule the world from Iraq. That's right. That probably doesn't surprise you. He spent $500 million trying to rebuild the ancient ruins of Babylon. If you go over there now, and a lot of our Marines and soldiers have been there and taken pictures, and you can see some of the construction progress. Part of the reason he wanted to do that is because he knew that there is a Jewish prophecy that said Babylon would never be rebuilt. And he wanted to show that the Jewish prophecies cannot be trusted, they're not dependable, I'll rebuild Babylon. Now, you can't thwart the prophecies of God. Let me read that prophecy to you. You find it in Isaiah chapter 13. Listen to what he says there. And this is verses 19 through 21. In Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It will never be inhabited, nor will it be settled from generation to generation. But the wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will dwell there. Wild goats will caper there. It would be barren. It would be empty. Matter of fact, to this very day, it's considered cursed by the Arabs that live in the vicinity. Well, as Saddam was first trying to build it, Desert Storm happened about 10 years ago. He began to recover from that, and he redirected attention to try and rebuild the city, and then we had the latest Iraq war. And what do you think? Is he going to succeed in his final goal? You can read in Jeremiah. It doesn't look like he's in charge of filling the throne of Nebuchadnezzar anymore. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 12. That prophet in the Bible said, I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it a perpetual desolation. It will not be inhabited again. And he tried to thwart that. Well, would you like to see a picture today of what it looks like? This was emailed to me just recently by a Marine who is in the vicinity. And the streets are deserted. It's almost as though God put a pox on the place and nobody goes. You can't overrule, you cannot thwart a prophecy of God. Well, I think we're all in agreement that Iraq is probably not going to be the final kingdom in the world, though there was at least one person who was hoping that. We know about the Egyptians had a great world empire, and the Assyrians. What will be the last world kingdom? Where do we go for the answers? In the Bible, it tells us that the prophecies show us the answer. You can read in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 19, we also have a more sure word of prophecy. Go to the prophecies to understand these things. And again, Amos chapter 3, verse 7, it tells us there in that ancient prophecy, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he reveals his secret unto his servants, the prophets. Anything major that God is going to do that will affect his work of his kingdom here on earth, the prophecies and the prophets have seen these things and they've revealed them. Now we're going to jump from Genesis to the book of Daniel. And this is the central focus of our study tonight, what I believe is one of the most amazing prophecies. I've taught this chapter for years, and I never tire. I never cease to marvel at how amazing it really is. If we go back to ancient Babylon, we're going to return to the time when King Nebuchadnezzar was at the zenith of his power, the undisputed ruler of the Middle East during this time. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he dreamed about this strange colossal image. And by the way, you know where the word colossal comes from? It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes, this great big bronze statue, bigger than the Statue of Liberty that flanked the harbor there at Rhodes. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and now if you'll turn in your Bibles, you're going to see the dream on your screen here. I'm going to read it to you from Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 35. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, his chest and his arms were of silver, its belly and its thighs were of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and it broke them to pieces. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, in this dream, in this vision, we find an outline for the major kingdoms of the world. And we're going to take a look now, and I use a question-answer format. I find people remember better when you do it that way. When Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, he knew it was not the ordinary dream from eating too much. And he woke up, he realized God has just revealed something to me. This was a three-dimensional apocalyptic dream, a vision that was very real and tacit. And he called together the wise men and the counselors in his kingdom, and he said, I've had this dream, and I want you to tell me what it means. But as often happens, sometimes you have a dream, and you say, wow, and you try and tell it to somebody later, and that part of your brain that remembers it, it shuts down. And you say, you know, it's foggy now, I can't remember. And the wise men said, well, Nebuchadnezzar, king, you tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. And he sort of suspected, he was a very smart king. You don't get to be a world ruler by being a numbskull. And he suspected that they were charlatans. And he said, look, if you're really in touch with the gods and you're able to give the interpretation of my dream, then I'm having trouble remembering it. The thing is gone from me. Tell me what the dream is, and then I'll know you can tell me the interpretation. Well, he called their bluff, and they began to shuffle their feet and say, well, no, that's not how it's supposed to work. You tell us the dream, and we'll manufacture an interpretation. And he said, you're frauds. And he, in his fury, because he knew that God had told him something in this dream, he had gone to sleep that night wondering how long his empire would last. He issued a decree in his haste that all the wise men should be gathered together and they would set a date on which they would all be executed. So, now I'm going to use my question-answer format. Question number 1. When the king's counselors failed to reveal and interpret the dream, what was Nebuchadnezzar's command? Daniel chapter 2, and by the way, I hope you'll read Daniel chapter 2 when you go home tonight. The king commanded to destroy all of the wise men of Babylon. Now, park that thought there, and I need to wind the tape back to Daniel chapter 1 and give you a little history. I mentioned earlier that King Nebuchadnezzar was the one who was responsible for conquering Jerusalem. And he destroyed the city, and he carried away the captives. It was burned in 586 BC. He carried away the captives to Babylon, many of them. Among the captives that were carried away, he handpicked young men that he thought showed the greatest promise for intelligence and ability and quickness. And he said, I'm going to train them in the University of Babylon, which was the best in the world at the time, so that they are prepared to live in the court of a king, and they can mediate between me and their people and give me some of the advice from their culture. Among those young men that were carried into that Babylonian university for this training were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, they were basically freshman wise men, if there is such a thing. Probably have some on your campus here, don't you? And in question number 2, when Daniel learned about the death decree, what did he ask of the king, and what did he tell his friends? The Bible tells us in Daniel 2, verse 16, Daniel went in before Nebuchadnezzar, and he asked the king that he would give him time. He says, you're never going to find out your dream by executing everybody. You give me time, I will pray, and I believe my God will give the answer. And he said, and we will show the king the interpretation. What would you do if you had to dream somebody else's dream? Then Daniel went to his house, chapter 2, verse 16, and he made known the thing to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret. Secret things belong to the Lord. Question number 3. When the Lord revealed the dream to Daniel, to whom did he give praise and credit? Now, this is important, because a lot of people who claim to be prophets, they say, you know, you pay my bill, I've got this special power, and it's in me, it's because of my wisdom and my insight. Daniel said, I'm not going to take the credit. Daniel said, there is a God in heaven that reveals, what's it say on the screen there? Secrets. This is a revelation in the book of Daniel. A secret is being revealed. He was giving God the credit. And then Daniel was finally brought before the king because he had said, I've had the dream. They praised the Lord for giving him the answer. And he began to unfold for King Nebuchadnezzar his dream. Now, I think this is very interesting. Only time in the Bible I know of that 2 different people had the same dream. And it's interesting that here you have the king has a dream. He doesn't know what it means. He must go to a Hebrew captive, essentially, to understand what the dream means. Reminds me of the book of Genesis, in the book of Genesis, where Joseph must come before the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh's wise men can't tell him what his dream means. Why is it that these Hebrews seem to have the answers? I think the Lord is telling us that among all the wonderful things in various religions of the world, that God had committed to the Jewish people the oracles of God. That's what Paul says. The true prophecies, the truth had been committed to this people. And here you've got these pagan kings that are going to these Jewish captives saying, what is truth? That's what Pilate said to Jesus. Number 4, why did Daniel say that God gave the king this dream? Answer? He said, there is a God in heaven that is revealing secrets, and he's making known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be, what's that say? In the latter days. Is that past or is that future? God is making known something about the future. Let's move on. Question number 5. What 2 objects did Daniel say the king saw in his dream? There are 2 principal things that were in this vision that you find here in chapter 2. He says, thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image, and thou sawest till a stone was cut without hands. So you've got this great image. Matter of fact, I just happen to have Nebuchadnezzar's image right here tonight. Someone saw me carry this to my room where I'm staying, and they thought that I lit candles before it at night. They thought, do you take that with you everywhere you go? This was given to me by a group for teaching prophecy. But maybe I'll just set him up here and he could stare you down while I'm teaching. You can keep that before you. Don't want to knock him over, not till later. Doesn't happen yet in the vision. So question number 6 now. as Daniel begins to interpret this vision, he begins to go through the various minerals, and these minerals represent the kingdoms of the world that would have a profound influence, especially on God's people. And he begins by telling King Nebuchadnezzar, what does the head of gold represent? Question number 6, Daniel chapter 2, verse 38. Thou art this head of gold. Babylon was a golden kingdom. Matter of fact, a couple of wonders of the ancient world, according to the historian Herodotus, the hanging gardens of Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar built for his queen were considered to be some of the most beautiful in the world. Exotic plants had been brought from all different parts of the world. Ancient Babylon was laid out, it's almost unbelievable, but I've read it, if the historians aren't exaggerating, 15 miles on each side, avenues 150 feet wide. You looked at the ruins that we saw that Saddam had excavated, and they were very wide streets, weren't they? 25 intersecting avenues like this. The wall 67 feet wide at the bottom, wide enough at the top for 4 chariots to run abreast across an interstate going across the top of the walls. Euphrates River ran underneath the walls of Babylon. It was the golden empire. Gold was everywhere. Great temple of Marduk was in the middle. The Babylonian Empire ruled for a comparatively short period of time, from about 606 to 536 BC. And you get an idea there of what the scope of their influence was. It was the Golden Kingdom. But as you can tell from our friend here, the whole thing's not gold. Nebuchadnezzar wanted that, and that comes up in chapter 3. But next comes another metal. Question number 7. Would the Babylonian kingdom last forever? No. Daniel 2, verse 39. And after these shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. Just as silver is a little bit inferior to gold, there would be another kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar did not want his kingdom to pass away. Matter of fact, they found among, there are millions of bricks you can go to ancient Babylon and find today where they're all stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's seal. And it says, this is the kingdom which I have built, may it last forever. And they also found this in the clay tablet that they have, a letter from Nebuchadnezzar. And on this letter in cuneiform, they've translated Babylon, this city which is the delight of my eyes, which I have glorified, may it last forever. Matter of fact, that quote where he says, I have built it, I have glorified it, you can find that in chapter 4 of Daniel, where he says, is not this the great Babylon that I have built? Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon was this great head of gold. Again, from about 605 to 539 BC, but it didn't last. Matter of fact, in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 5, it tells about the fall of Babylon. See, after Nebuchadnezzar died, he had a son, Nabonidus. Some call him Evil Merodach. And then he had a grandson named Belshazzar. Why Belshazzar's father was out trying to preserve the empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built, Belshazzar had sort of a wild party. Even though he knew the Persians were camped outside, he thought, they're just a mosquito, they're not going to bother us. How they can never get through our walls? And so to mock the army camped outside the walls, he had this party. And you've heard the expression of the handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar had this feast, this big banquet hall of Babylon that was supposed to be hundreds of yards long. They had peacocks pulling chariots with the different beverages. And he wanted to show that he wasn't afraid of anybody. And he said, go get the sacred vessels that we captured from the Temple of Solomon. We're going to bring them in here, and we're going to show that Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, he's not a God. And we're going to use their vessels, and we're going to toast our gods. Everything was about a battle between the gods. And so he brought those sacred vessels that had been captured from the temple of God, and they filled them with alcohol. They began to drink and toast their various pagan idols. And while he was making a mockery of the God of heaven, a bloodless hand began to appear in burning letters, write this cryptic writing on the walls of the banquet hall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. I remember the first time I read the Bible up there in the cave, and it talked about the handwriting on the wall. I went, oh, that's where that phrase comes from. I had no idea. People always said handwriting on the wall. I had no idea it came out of the Bible. I had a lot of epiphanies when I was reading the Bible about all the sayings people use. It says that there by the candlestick, we're in Daniel chapter 5, verse 5, fingers of a man's hand wrote over against the candlestick on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the words were, And here's a translation. Oh, by the way, once again, Belshazzar, his knees smote together. He was terrified. He said, what does this mean? I mean, wouldn't it make you nervous if right now all of a sudden a fiery hand appeared and began to write on the walls in our church? That'd be sort of ominous, especially if it happens during a drunken party. It's not good. And he's wondering, what does this mean? And the wise men, they're just as scared as he is, and they don't know what it means. And so guess who they call? Guess who's still alive 70 years later? Daniel, who's now an old man. They knew in him was the Spirit of God, and they said, tell us, what does this writing mean? We'll give you all these gifts. And Daniel said, keep your gifts because I know what the writing means. And he translated it, meaning, which means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. The time for Babylon's curtain had come down. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances. There's a judgment, and you are found wanting. He was not Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar ended up turning to the God of heaven towards the end of his life. And Perez was the last cryptic saying. Daniel said that means your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That very night, as I said, Cyrus, the Persian general, was outside the walls, and they were having a party inside. They thought he'll never get through these walls. But what Cyrus did, very brilliant. The Euphrates River actually ran under the walls of ancient Babylon. They found a dry lake bed. They dug a canal miles upstream. They diverted the Euphrates River into this dry lake bed. The water level going under the walls of Babylon dropped, and the army of Cyrus marched underneath the walls through the mud. Everybody in the city was drunk. They left the doors open because they didn't anticipate that there would be an attack. They thought this would be a long siege. And it was even foretold in the Bible, hundreds of years before Cyrus was born, that Babylon would fall to this general, and it names him by name. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. This is an amazing thing to me because we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that this was written before the event. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him. Just names him out of nowhere, this Persian name. And I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates will not be shut. Once they went under the wall within the inner city, the gates giving access had been left open. That's just amazing. Matter of fact, you can go to the British Museum in London, and they've unearthed this cylinder. It's called the Cyrus cylinder. And on that cylinder, Cyrus recounts how amazed he was how easily this great kingdom fell. He thought that it would be a siege lasting many years and a fierce battle, and they just fell over. The Bible had foretold in Jeremiah and in Isaiah that the soldiers of Babylon would be weak like women and would not be able to fight. This then brings us to the next empire, which is the Medo-Persian kingdom, and it goes a little longer. It goes from 539 to 331 BC. And unless you fell asleep during your history class in elementary school, you've all heard of the Persian Empire. Started out as the Medo-Persian Empire. You notice here the statue, the silver, has two arms. Later in Daniel, you've got a bear raised up on one side. It's talking about a dual or two parallel kingdoms, later simply known as the Persian kingdom. One of their most beautiful capitals was not just Babylon, but it was Persepolis. And these are some of the ruins, a magnificent kingdom, very powerful, warlike people, the Persians. And they have depicted in many of the graphs in the museums, you can see that they like to portray those they had conquered being humiliated. Some have speculated that crucifixion may have originated with the Persians and then been picked up by the Carthaginians and then eventually by the Romans. We have a silver goose here that they unearthed in Persepolis. And one reason I showed you that, you've heard of the goose that laid the golden egg? This is the silver goose. It lays titanium eggs. No, we don't know that. But I showed you this because silver was the currency in the Persian kingdom. So it makes sense that it was typified by silver. Now we go to question number 8. What metal would represent the kingdom that followed the Medo-Persians? Daniel 2, verse 39. And another third kingdom of brass that will bear rule over all the earth. What kingdom do you think this is? If you were awake in history class, we know that Greece came on the scene. Now I need to pause here and just mention something that people often ask, and I'll see if I could preempt a question. Doug, are you telling me that the only kingdoms that were world kingdoms back during that time were Babylon and Medo-Persia and Greece? What about the great Chinese Empire and the Inca and the Aztec. Weren't there other world empires? Yes. In the vision of Daniel 2, it is principally dealing with those kingdoms that had a profound impact on God's people, whether it be Israel or later the church. Those are the ones that are addressed. It's not that the others weren't important or that God did not factor them in. Here you've got a map of what the Greek dominion looked like. They had, of course, a very vast empire that stretched all the way from India to the eastern Mediterranean. One historian, speaking of this famous king, who is the famous king, the first Macedonian king of the Greek Empire? Alexander the Great. I am persuaded that there was no nation, city, nor people then being, whether his name did not reach. There seems to have been some divine hand presiding over both his birth and his actions. Alexander, considered to be a genius of a general, just went from one victory to another, employed these extremely amazing tactics, creative tactics in battle, and rose very quickly. The Greek influence spread. Alexander, though, as he continued with his success, he began to think he was a god. He went to Egypt and went to one of the temples there and had himself pronounced a god. And that wasn't long after that. He went to Babylon and he died. They don't know if it was a combination of drinking too much and malaria, but he died very suddenly as a young man. Matter of fact, as he was dying, he had not had an heir yet. His wife Roxana said, "Who will rule in your place?" And supposedly his parting words were the strongest, because he had not chosen an heir. That's exactly what happened. His 4 generals began to fight among themselves over the territory of the Greek Empire. Bronze was what they used for their armor. Oh, by the way, if you read in the Bible, it will say that this next kingdom is a kingdom of brass. Brass, as we know it today, was not really developed by the alchemists until about the 16th century. This is really bronze that we're talking about, but the Old English word used the word brass there. Greece ruled from about 331 to 168 BC. That was the next world empire. Now, what's really interesting about this, Daniel lived to see the Persians come on the scene. Daniel, even in the book of Daniel, foretells that Greece would be the next world empire by name, hundreds of years before it happened. Only God can do that. That's why many of the skeptics have said Daniel could not have been written when they claim it was written. It could not have been written by the prophet Daniel, because no one can have that much prophetic knowledge of the future. So their critics have always tried to find some way to attribute Daniel to some other late author. Next, question 9. What metal represents the 4th kingdom? Now we're getting down here to the legs. It says in Daniel 2, verse 40, "The 4th kingdom shall be strong as," say it with me, iron. I want to make sure we're still awake here in Michigan. "For as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and iron that breaks all these things shall break in pieces and bruise." Rome was known as the Iron Monarchy. Matter of fact, they had iron swords. The Greeks had bronze swords. I was in a welding class one time, and my teacher, who studied history, he said, back then you could take an iron sword and you could cut a bronze sword in 2 if you had a sharp iron sword. And you remember when David managed to get the sword of Goliath, the Philistines had iron swords, and he said there is none like it. And so this was the Iron Kingdom. And it was during the time of the Iron Monarchy of Rome that Jesus was born. They were iron swords that went into Bethlehem and slaughtered the baby boys there. It was an iron spear that pierced Jesus' side. This was the Iron Monarchy. Edward Gibbons, who did not claim to be a Christian, actually drew from the prophecies of Daniel in describing the Roman Empire in his famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He said the images of gold and silver or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successively broken by the Iron Monarchy of Rome. So Rome ruled now from about 168 BC to the mid-4th century. The scholars and historians they're not agreeing about exactly when Rome fell, because Rome was not conquered decisively like some of these other kingdoms. Instead, the Roman Empire sort of disintegrated which actually leads us to our next question. Question number 10. What would happen after the fall of the Roman Empire? We're tracing our way down from the head through the feet here, into the legs rather. It says, the kingdom shall be divided as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay. So the kingdom will be partly strong and partly broken. Little by little, because of the excesses in Rome, because of the encroachment of other empires from the outside, they were being attacked by the Huns. Edward Gibbon, in his book, he attributes the fall of Rome to the moral erosion within the empire. Matter of fact, if you study some of the 5 elements that preceded the fall of ancient Rome, you can find many of those same things in our country today. Talked about the breakdown of the family, government spending irresponsibly. A lot of it was on armaments, or the bulk of it, and just a moral collapse. The people were preoccupied with entertainment. Did you hear that? The Romans became preoccupied with the theater and entertainment and sporting events, instead of the other nations that were coming in from the outside. Life began to be a big party. And little by little, Rome disintegrated. Not all at once, but it fell. And what did it turn into? It didn't turn into one more power, one more kingdom. It was divided in what you see today, split around Europe. And some of the names that are traditionally used, the ancient divisions of the Roman Empire, are the Alemanni, which we know as the Germans, the Franks or the French, the Burgundian, which is Switzerland, the Suevi, Portugal, the Lombards, which is Italy, the Visigoths, Spain, the Anglo-Saxons, England, and there are 3 others you'll find in Daniel chapter 7, talks about 3 horns that are uprooted, and that would be the Heruli, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths, and they don't exist today. But you can still see the remnants of the Roman Empire. All you got to do is go to Washington, D.C. Matter of fact, many of the world rulers wanted to reproduce the power of ancient Rome. That leads us well to our next question. Question 11. Would these kingdoms ever succeed in uniting again so that there would be another world empire, another kingdom? What did Daniel say? Chapter 2, verse 43. It says, they'll mingle themselves with the seed of men, a lot of intermarriage, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with miry clay. They all wanted to recreate the empire of the Caesars. Some of you remember, well, you may not remember Tsar Nicholas. I don't think there's anyone here that old. Well, yeah, actually there may be. Tsar is the Russian way of saying Caesar. Kaiser, anyone speak German here? Kaiser is the German word for Caesar. And a lot of these monarchs wanted to take the title of the ancient Caesars. There's even somewhere you can go in Las Vegas called Caesars, where you could fantasize that you're living back in the Roman Empire days. People are preoccupied with that era because they figured it was one of the greatest empires. Now, something's happening here I want you to notice. What's worth more, gold or silver? Gold's worth more than silver, right? What's worth more, silver or bronze? Silver. And what's worth more, bronze or iron? Bronze. Well, I don't know. China's made iron pretty expensive right now. And you would think, before you get to the feet of iron and clay, iron by itself must be worth more than clay. It's in abundance. Something's happening here. As you go down, the metals are less valuable, but they're harder. They're stronger. Gold is very soft and malleable. And silver is softer than bronze, which is softer than iron. And I'll get to the last mineral here in just a few moments. But many have tried to reunite the world empire that they had under ancient Rome. You had Queen Victoria. You realize that during her long 60-year reign, this golden era of England, she had 40 grandchildren. She really just wanted to be a grandma. That was her greatest joy. But because they kept trying to forge peace through marriages and alliances, by the time of her death, she was related to virtually every head of state in Europe in one way or another, because they were trying to weld this fragile real estate back together again into one empire. And they're trying to do it again today with the European Union and the euro through a common currency. But what does the Bible foretell would happen? It said they will not cleave one to another. There will never again be another one-world kingdom. Pastor Doug, wait a second. Doesn't the Bible tell us in Revelation that just before Jesus comes, there's a one-world kingdom and that kingdom forces everybody to worship? No, that's not what it says. It's not a one-world kingdom. It talks about many kings. There's one-world worship. It says he compels all to worship. But the governments of the world are going to remain divided until the end. Of course, we know that you've got Charlemagne tried to do it. Louis XIV tried to do it. You've got Napoleon who tried to do it. Mussolini, Hitler, and some of them came close. At Waterloo, Napoleon was stopped, and if it hadn't been for some misdirected orders and bad weather, we'd probably all be speaking French right now. But God intervened. Matter of fact, Napoleon, when he talked about why he failed to reclaim the kingdom, he said, God is against me. Because everything said that he should have won. It's not going to be another world empire with one of these kingdoms. Question number 12. Who is going to set up the final kingdom? The Bible tells us, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Friends, it's not going to be Charlemagne, it's not going to be Napoleon or Hitler or Mussolini or Louis XIV or Saddam Hussein. It's going to be King Jesus is going to be the next king. Now, when we get down to the feet, which is where we are now, I want you to think about something interesting. The feet are what? It says they are iron mixed with clay, and then later it says miry clay. Someone who used to teach at this university told me, he says, that is a perfect definition for the #1 building material in the world today, which is concrete. Some of you have heard of the Pantheon. You know, the Pantheon, Romans began to use concrete, but it wasn't all reinforced at first. They had a primitive method of using it. But what do you think the #1 building material is in the world today? It is iron mixed with miry clay. We got some video footage here that a friend in Sacramento took, and just everywhere you look, Sacramento's exploding. See the iron, reinforced iron? And what does that mush look like? If you were the prophet Daniel and you had to describe what you saw as the final material, what better description could you find rather than iron mixed with miry clay? We are living in the age of concrete. Something else that's interesting is if you ever have to bust up a concrete foundation, you find that the iron is not mixed with the clay. The rebar is still separate. And even though there's an appearance of unity, it is not commingled. It's still separate. We're living right now in the very last part of this vision. Again, I want to remind you, this is one of the most important prophecies in the Bible because, first of all, it is a dream that is repeated twice. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He's wanting to know what the future will be of his kingdom. God gives him this supernatural vision, but he doesn't understand it. The pagan wise men do not understand it. So a Jewish boy is called in, and he is given the same dream. You know, sometimes you might say, I forgot the dream, but then something happens during the day and you have deja vu and it comes back. Can you imagine what the look must have been on that mighty monarch's face as this Judean captive comes in and he says, by God's grace, I will tell you the interpretation of your dream and I'll tell you what your dream is. If someone can tell you what your dream is, would you think you could trust them to tell you what the interpretation is? I think that we can trust that this is one of the most amazing prophecies in the Bible because it is giving us an outline for the kingdoms of the world. We're living in the last days, friends. I believe that. We're down in the feet of iron mixed with miry clay. I was going to say as a footnote, but that would sort of be a pun, huh? We're in the toenails of the image right now because Rome fell hundreds of years ago. What does that mean? That means God has a plan for your life, doesn't he? Question number 13. What does the stone do to the other world kingdoms? It says, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, don't miss that, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and it broke them in pieces. And the stone that struck the image becomes a great mountain, and it fills the whole earth. Now, I deliberately wanted to put this out here to help you realize, what does this look like to you? Pretend that you had not read Daniel chapter 2. If somebody brought this and set it down and knelt before it, what would you call it? This is an idol. What does the Ten Commandments say? And by the way, what are the Ten Commandments written on? Stone. Jesus said, "He that hears these words of mine is a wise man building on the rock." Christ is the rock of ages. Christ is the Word. The Word is written on rock. What is it that destroys all the counterfeit pagan idols and false religions? It was an idol. An idol, especially in the Ten Commandments, it represented all of the counterfeit, false religions and kingdoms. Whenever you pray the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done, thy kingdom come." Why would you pray thy kingdom come if it's already here? Now the spiritual kingdom has come, but God's final kingdom hasn't come yet, has it? Some people say, yeah, the stone happened way back in the days when Jesus came the first time, and that was the end of that vision. No, I'm sorry, friends. That leaves out the rest of Rome and the divisions of Rome. That's not what happened. It's talking about Jesus' literal kingdom. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. And he is not going to share his kingdom with any other kingdom, according to Daniel. When Jesus' kingdom comes, it will fill the whole earth, and all the others are pulverized. That idol and all those other metals, they are pulverized and they are blown away like the chaff of the summer threshing floor, so no place for them is found. They are gone. So it's telling us that when that stone strikes it, by the way, that stone cut out without hands, out of a mountain without hands. You know, in the Bible, you can read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, all of the pagan nations, when they made gods and when they worshiped their God, they always had these idols. And it could be a cow, it could be a man, a fish. But the Jews were told to be very careful to avoid idolatry. And it said in Exodus 20, verse 25, if you make an altar of stone, they could make an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. Don't chisel on it, don't hew it, don't cut it. Matter of fact, he says, if you lift up your tool on it, you've polluted it. Don't even be tempted to shape it into anything. It must be without man's hands. It's a battle between the worship of the true God and counterfeit worship. When did Babylon fall? When they were worshiping the wrong gods. Furthermore, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1, Paul says, for we know that if our earthly house, this tabernacle, were dissolved, we have a building of God in a house not made with hands. So when God makes something, it's talking about not with man's hands. Because God speaks and it happens. When Christ brings his kingdom, it's coming because of his word. That's the rock that's going to come and destroy everything else. You know, one reason I think that this prophecy is so important is because I want you to know that God has a plan for your life. Now, before I close, I want to quickly review because I want these things to settle into your mind. And I'm going to come back over here to Frederick and use him. First kingdom is, head of gold is what kingdom? Babylon, from about 600 to 536 BC. The silver represents what kingdom? You who are watching at your various sites, you can speak too. It's the Medo-Persian kingdom. Then you've got the bronze, which is what kingdom? Greece. The iron is Rome, about 168 to approximately 476. The feet of iron and clay, they're the divisions of the Roman Empire, which is where we are now. We're here. So what happens next? The next thing to happen is the Lord coming. Now, I travel all over the world, and sometimes I don't know where I am. Matter of fact, I travel sometimes so much that I wake up and I fumble around the hotel room to find a piece of paper that tells me where I am. It's true. You ever wake up a little disoriented in your own house? When you travel a lot, you wake up and you go, this doesn't look familiar. Sometimes I get out of bed and I walk into the wall because things have moved from my home. And as I travel, sometimes I'll go to foreign subway systems, and I don't like being lost. And I found that it really helps if you can get a map. And I remember when I was back in New York City, they've got a great subway system there, and it's all color-coded. And you'll find that in France, you'll find that in Russia, you'll find that in Korea, you'll find it in Japan. I've been to all these different subway systems, and it can be very confusing. If you're from another country and you're trying to get underground from one place to another, but it's really helpful if you've got one of these maps. And it says there on the map, you will be taking the green line, and then you'll run into the yellow line. And so I get on, and pretty soon, sure enough, everything in the terminal is yellow. I think this must be it. So I get out, and then it says you switch over to a blue train, and it'll say 23rd Street. You get over there, and I'm trying to get to Grand Central. And I look at my map, and it says you're going to go from 23rd, you're going to go to 19th, you're going to go to 8th Street, you're going to go to these various names. And all along the way, I look at my map, and I say everything is right on schedule. And then, you know what's really nice is when you get to the place just before Grand Central, and you say, this is the last stop, I know the next stop is my destination. What's our next stop according to this vision? Jesus is coming. And in future presentations, I'm going to tell you why I believe it is imminent, friends. That is going to happen very soon, sooner than most people think. Question number 14. After hearing Daniel's clear interpretation of the dream, what did Nebuchadnezzar say about the Lord? He said, Daniel 2, verse 47, the king answered and said to Daniel, it is of a truth that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. Daniel closes by reminding him. He says, the dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. Do you know what's going to happen tomorrow? Do you worry about what's going to happen tomorrow? Do you worry about your future? Especially here at a university, sometimes young people are wondering, what am I supposed to do? Is there a plan for my life? What's the future? Is it all just haphazard, indiscriminate, coincidence? Or is there a plan? Is somebody at the wheel? Does God have a plan for my life? I'll tell you, friends, if you had told me about 30 years ago when I was up there in the mountains running around like a nut, where I would be today, I had no idea. But I know now God had a plan for my life. And I want you to know He's got a plan for your life. It's a good plan. Why do you think the Lord gives us these prophecies? To entertain us, to prove that He's God and impress us? No, it's because He wants to redeem us. Don't forget this. The purpose of all prophecy is redemptive. It's not so we can know what movie stars are getting married next. It's redemptive. Prophecy is not so we can know how to invest in the stock market. It's to know how we can be saved. It's teaching us that you and I can know that we can trust the Lord. Have you trusted your life to the Lord? God brought you here tonight. If you're at your locations, wherever you are, you might be watching home on TV. You might be in a church gathering. God brought you, I believe that. And I want you to come back. I believe the Lord wants you to come back. He has a plan for your life. He brought you because He wants you to know that He wants to save you desperately. So much so that that same Rock of Ages that's coming soon, Jesus, He died to forgive you and to save you.